Okay, so we're on Nun Beis Omid Aleph, about the middle of the page. Actually, we're going to just step back a couple of lines so we can get a running start on understanding what we're talking about. We'll just review quickly. We're in the middle of the page where it says Ad Kama Tipcha, and there's a little bit of there's a hey. There's a hey at the beginning of the word ad in the middle of the line. It's almost smack in the middle of the page, maybe a little bit higher than the middle. In the middle, it says Ad Kama Tipcha. So we're talking about coinage and the eroding of coins so that it's not worth the value of the coin, which gives rise to the problem of oh no. Because if you're buying something for $1 and it's a coin and the coin has rubbed out, and let's say it's worth only 75 cents, then in round numbers, then you've got an oinoa situation. Even though the coin's in circulation, the coin's being used, but theoretically, it doesn't have the value. Now, maybe in a practical sense, when we're buying and selling, someone looks at a quarter, oh, it's got a partly rubbed out George Washington, big deal. But the Gemara is being very medactic and saying that that coin is not worth what it should be at its face value. Can you use it and not be over or no? That's what our whole discussion is about. And we're going to hone in on a couple of fine points now, how to understand that. But that's basically, we're saying there's a difference between oino of money, of kesef, and oino of goods. Goods, which we had been talking about before, that we knew we were strictly speaking about, 1/6 of the value. But when it comes to coinage, we saw that the Mishnah has three Manda Amrim who have different views, the 6th, the 12th, the 24th. And the Gemara asks those questions. Why is there a difference between coins and garments? Why do we look at it differently? But so is to our point here, we're going to start where it says Atkama Tiftach v'Rishoy Lekane. In other words, how much can a coin have a reduction of its, let's say it's silver content. If it was silver, how much can it have a reduction, and it still will be permitted to keep it and to use it. So now the denominations that we're basically using are the Sela is the high number, then shekel, two shekalim in a Sela, and then dinar, 2 dinrim in a shekel. So there's 2 dinrim in a shekel, 4 dinrim in a Sela. And what the Gemara is telling us is that if it goes halfway down, up to a halfway down, it's okay. So what are we saying? Besela at shekel. If a sela has reduced its sort of value down to a shekel, which means 50%, bedina, but it says bedina ad rova, but bedina ad rova until it's a quarter, which we'll ask that and we'll explain that in a minute. But bedina, it's a quarter. So those are the shiurim upon which you can still use the coin. Pachas, mikain, iser. If it's 1 iser, which is a much smaller coin, 1 iser less than half, meaning a shekel, or in the case of dinar, a quarter, if it's 1 iser less, then you can no longer use it. Harzeh loyim karena, then you should no longer even retain it, because then it no longer should be in circulation, because people will confuse it and think it's a valuable coin. You have to take it out of circulation. That's how far you have to go. So then it says, Lola Tager, you should not, in other words, he's giving you examples of who you should not give it to, because they're going to maybe cheat. So Lola Tager, not to a storekeeper, okay? Velola Cherem, or someone who is known to be he extorts for money, velola hareg, and not to a murderer. Why? These are categories of people who would have no, they wouldn't think twice about cheating. So in other words, you can't sort of say, okay, I'm going to offload this coin, I'll give it to some fellow and let him deal with it. So basically, what do we do? Eliyikvena, he says you should make a hole. Yislena bitzaver beno o bitzaver bito. Okay, so we said that last time. Basically, you have to puncture it, you have to destroy it, then use it as a necklace. I mean, if you hang the coin around your neck, basically, it's not going to do any harm. So, what is the Gemara telling us? Gemara is telling us that there is a minimum shiur upon which a coin can lose its value and still be used in the marketplace, and people will have, so to speak, the full faith and confidence of the of the monetary system. Otherwise, it'll be hefker, and then people won't feel comfortable. Do I have a coin? Is it valuable? Is it not valuable? So that's how the Gemara is now couching what we should do and how we should do it. Okay, so that's the principle. Now we'll pick up from there. So we had a brisa, which we said before. The brisa told us that we had it earlier in this daf, where ad kamati sela chaser v'yeh bo oino. In other words, how much can a sela be reduced and it won't be a no? So we brought down again 3 shiurim, right? Was different than by a chayfetz. By shiurim we had Reb Meir, right, who said 4 iser per sela, iser ladiner. Reb Yehuda, who said dalet peronios, 4 pujonios, dalet pujonios. And Reb Shimon, who said shmona pinjos. So each one had a lesser shiur for the oino than did Reb Meir. So that's important because we're going to ask who is the real mandamar? Who are we holding like? Okay, so says the Gemara Omar Mar, right? Besela ad shekel bedina ad rova. That which we just said, and we just read this now, that by sela you can reduce it up to a shekel and a dinar until a rova, and it's still considered usable in the marketplace, right? Frek the Gemara, right? My shno bedinar adro, my shno besela ad shekel. Why is a sela valid up to a shekel, which means 50%? My shno bedinar adrova. The obvious question. We said right before that for a dinar it's a quarter. Why a quarter? Why shouldn't it be a half? In other words, just like a half a sela is still valid, a half a dinar should be valid. Why does it say bedinar ad rova until a quarter? So that was the Gemara's kasha. So now the Gemara wants to give a couple of answers. Oma Abaya. Abaya says, my rova diktani nami, that which the Gemara says rova, he does not mean it is half a dinar, right? Why do we call it a rova? Rova shekel, because 1 dinar is a quarter of a shekel. So in other words, the question is, rova shekel, it's a quarter of a shekel and not a quarter of a dinar. So the question is, why do we use that terminology? So Abai is saying because a sela is what is sort of the coin of the realm. That's what everybody uses a sela. So to say that you can use it up to a half a sela, that's a shekel, that's fine. But to say that you can use that sela up to a quarter of the sela, which is what? 1 dinar, because we're using the sela as the measuring stick, not the shekel. So really 1 dinar is okay because it's a half a shekel, and we say that a half a shekel is okay. But we couch it in terms of a quarter of a sela because the sela is really sort of the main coin. So according to Abaya, this is a terminology issue. We don't have a problem that we're dealing with 2 different measurements, a half of one and a quarter of another. Not at all. It's really all the same. It's if you reduce the coin by half, it's okay. The reason why we call it rova is because we're measuring dinar in terms of sela, not in terms of shekel. So that's Abaya's answer, and it's a logical answer, but he's saying that the terminology is all based on sela. Now, Omar Rava, so comes Rava and he says, Dekanami, I'll bring you a raya that Abaya is right? Why? Because the Kotani Rova, because it says the word Rova, a quarter, v'lo Kotani Revia, and doesn't say a fourth. So in other words, he's now being medactic in the language of the Gemara and saying that because it says a quarter, that we understand is a quarter of a sela. If he had said 1/4, we would have had a problem, because then it might have meant 1/4 of a shekel, which then would be less than 1 dinar. It would be a half a dinar, and that would not even be good, because it would be below that halfway mark. So he's saying, because of the terminology of rova and not revia, shema milah, that we're talking about 1/4 of a selah, which is a half of a shekel, and a half of a shekel is okay. So that's Rava's. That's the teretz, that the Gemara's use of the terminology is because of the parlance of the day, which is that selah is the main coin. So when you refer to a coin, you refer to it based on the selah. It's either half a selah or a quarter of a selah. Half a selah is a shekel, quarter of a selah is a dinar. Each one of them is okay. Fine. All right. So now the Gemara has kind of given us a little bit of a clarity on how you use money, and when it up to when it doesn't become ono. Now, keep in mind that these coins are being used every day, probably in many cases without second thought. So what the Gemara is telling us is really a very fine point, that in order not to be over ono, this is how the coin has to look. But in reality, when we use coins today, I mean, maybe they don't even erode that much, but if you keep a coin around long enough and it starts eroding, do you care? I mean, you put it into the slot and you use it, you hand it to the storekeeper and you use it. No one pays attention. So
yeah, but there's a big difference. We're not counting on the metal content, and in fact, the mint tries to make sure they've redone the penny. Sometimes they redid the silver coins, like the $quarter-and-a-half and dollar 50 years ago, because we want to make sure that the content is the actual true value, for better or worse. You could argue either way, but that the actual true metal value is less than the face value. So if eroded, it's still probably less than the face value. So it's not a question of what would happen if you melted it down. Would it really be worth that amount? But that was the issue in the time of the Gemara.
right, but I'm saying that in
so therefore we don't care now.
Right.
As long as you can still tell it's a quarter and not a nickel, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. But we'll see that even in the time of the Gemara, the Gemara gives a condition that you're allowed to use it, but if someone complains, then you have to make good. So it seems also that people were not maybe as makbid about, is it really, really worth what we're saying it's worth? But the Gemara wanted to ensure. But if someone was makbid, then you have to honor his akbada, and you have to say, yeah, I have to give you the value. But it doesn't seem as if that was first and foremost in many people's minds. They were okay as long as you can understand what the coin is. It's a shekel, it's a selah, it's a dinar. They used it. So I'm not sure how much different was it today, but again, in the Gemara parlance, you're allowed to complain, you're allowed to make a taina and get the differential. Today, I don't think. I mean, in our system, I don't think if you got upset and said to the storekeeper that you wanted some change based on the weight of the coin or something, he'd look at you like you were a Martian or something.
Well, I think one key is that in the time of the Gemara, since obviously there was a point, whether we've seen different things, sixth, a quarter, a half, whatever it is, a certain point where we say, oh, this coin has to be taken out of circulation. Well, at that point, I think, and this is a key difference, today, it doesn't really happen with coins. It happens with dollar bills, though. A dollar bill is so worn out that you take it out of circulation. You take it to the bank trades it in with the Federal Reserve. I don't know the exact mechanism. They basically trade it in and they get a fresh dollar.
Right.
Where they deposit them, whatever. They get a fresh dollar bill out of it somehow.
Right.
Whereas with the coins, again, it might be a little different today. Back then, I don't think that you could go to the if you walked into the mint in it, whether in Israel or Rome or whatever, and took a bundle of shekels that are all rubbed down, I don't think they would hand you back. You give 100 rubbed down shekels, that they would hand you back 100 freshly minted shekels, because they would assume, this guy's been cheating. He shaved a little bit off of each one. He's taking that extra silver and he's going to melt it down elsewhere and sell it
and make another coin.
Right. And especially, if you could be down to a half, you could make quite a bit. So I don't think you could do that, which would mean to me, and I could be wrong, that the way you would do it is, oh, now these coins are worn out. It'll be no different from a broken coin or something, or bits of silver or whatever. And you would, and say, well, copper, gold, same thing. And then you would take it and you would measure it by weight. And based on weight, if the weight of these 100 shekel coins is really 70 shekels worth of silver, then if you traded it into the mint, you would get 70 fresh shekels. And if that's the case, whoever is the last one standing
Right.
would be out the difference. So it's to your advantage once it gets to a certain point, if you're a savvy businessman or consumer, to look and say, oh, these are getting a little low. I don't want to take these because I know that I might be the one that gets stuck with them
The
on the
last
next
one,
round,
right.
and then I'm out the money.
Right.
Part of the money. That's
Right.
my thought. I don't know if I'm right. That's my thought.
Yeah, no, but yeah, I mean, maybe that was what was on people's mind. Although, when people are running around in business and they're hurrying and using coins, how much do they really sort of focus on? Oh, am I really getting 100 cents on the dollar, or is it 98 cents? Yeah, maybe there are people who are makbid. In fact, the Gemara is going to use the taina later, which we had in the Mishnah, that under certain circumstances you can't legally challenge, but you can complain. They use the word tarumos. You can complain. So the Gemara is going to explain over there, what does it mean complain? Who complains? You complain, but you don't have any legal result. So the Gemara wants to justify that there are people who, like maybe Masha, like you said, maybe I'm makbid. I may not get anywhere, but let me raise the issue. Let me just say, I'm complaining. Okay, I got it off my chest. I'm complaining. So you see that the Gemara is even saying that there is maybe a class of people who know they can't get anywhere with it, but they have to complain to make it known that this is sort of an unfair practice. Who knows what'll happen? So again, it's unclear at that time how much of this was going on, and again, the fact that the Gemara in coming together on this Mishnah and having this discussion means that there was some tumult. They were tumbling here, and the Gemara has to clarify what's the tumbling. What are we tumbling about? And the Gemara gives it's an understanding of what the tumult was. And again, we can maybe we can take from that how we should adjust our thinking today, or maybe not. But it's an interesting thinking, because in the series of the Gemara, we want to understand how they were thinking at the time. And again, distinctions between coins and merchandise. All of this is sort of fascinating to look back in the rearview mirror and understand how Klal Yisrael was operating a couple thousand years ago. In any event, so I think we have a pretty good understanding of where we are. So now let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi, maybe about a dozen lines before the lines get wider on the bottom. It's Divrei Maskil B'Sela ad shekel. So it's telling us that you can reduce it from a sela by sela ad shekel, which is half. So says Rashi, sela hatoveo pochos v'hoilech ad shekel mutter. If it reduces up to a shekel, which is 50%, it's mutter l'kaima. Dein also l'ramas bo b'nei adam l'mochel b'sela yafeh, because no one's looking to cheat anybody to sell it for. When they call the seller yafeh, he means 100% seller. L'fi shepochos shelo nicker, because people recognize when a seller has been rubbed down. So on the face of it, people are going to see, oh, this isn't really a seller yafa, meaning worth 100%, but we can still use it. So up to a shekel, in other words, if it's reduced, let's say a half, and it still is above the shekel, people will accept it as a seller, even though the eye test is that it's not a complete seller because it's rubbed out. Aval mishapachas mishekel, when it dips below a shekel, which means 50%, lo yikai menu, then you shouldn't hold on to it. Lefi shabal ramos, because they're saying that the mindset of someone who uses that coin is to cheat, ulamachro b'torah shekel, and to use it as a shekel when it is now no longer a shekel because it dipped below. She'em pacha shelo nicker legabe shekel, because it's not easily as recognizable that it is less than a shekel. Less than a selah, you can see, oh, a selah has this width and this thickness, and now it's really rubbed out. But you know what? It still looks pretty close to a selah. We'll consider it a selah. But once it dips in actuality below a shekel, people aren't necessarily going to recognize that it is less than a shekel, and they're going to say, "Oh, it's at least a shekel. It may not be a selah, but it's a shekel." And in truth, it is now worn down to less than a shekel. So to be very specific, you shouldn't even use it as a shekel. Rashi says that's when someone is going to try to cheat and get away with using it as a shekel, even though it no longer is a shekel because it dipped below that 50% mark, right? B'toch shehu rochev shebetchila hayasela enanira chaser mishekel, right? Because in the beginning, when it starts getting rubbed out, it rubs out a little bit, but it still has a nice larger form, so people will still consider it to be a seller. But once it starts getting, and I don't know I don't know how quickly it took those coins to be rubbed out. Maybe they were softer coins and didn't have sort of the sturdiness or the hardness of our coin. I mean, how today to get a coin to rub out, I'm not even sure you can handle it 1,000,000 times, 2,000,000 times. Is it really going to rub out? I mean, it's a solid coin. Those coins in those days had a certain width, but they maybe have been softer coins, so they didn't have the hardness that we
So
that we have.
the common coins then were silver and copper. Gold is very expensive as it is today. Silver and copper. Silver and copper, if they're close to pure, are very soft metals,
Soft
relatively
metal.
speaking. The coins we have today, at least in the U.S., are
Have
alloys,
alloys and things, right?
and they're alloys partly to save money, but also it affects the strength. You can take two metals that are each relatively soft and alloyed together; they can be much stronger. And so I think
Right.
the result is ours are
Right. So I
much
think
stronger.
that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the purer coins that were softer and they would rub down. So again, that's something we have to think about. So therefore, we're saying that you have to be more attuned to that. This is Rashi's telling us. Shem pachas shel nikar legabe shekel mitoch shehu rochev shebetchila hayasela enenira choser mishekel. Shekel hu matbea shel chatzi sela v'dina matbea cotton and shnai mehem yesh b'shekel. And a dinner is in other words, a shekel is a matbea of half a sela, but a dinner is a separate coin that is smaller, and two of them make a shekel. So with a dinner, I mean, you're dealing with a different realm of coin, whereas with a shekel, you could still be using the seller coin, but lesser value. So therefore, he's saying that's why we have to be more makbid, and when that seller starts rubbing down to approximately the shekel, that's when you have to start being concerned. Now, he uses the term bedina ad rova, im hoyadina nifris, if it was diminished, acha omad al rova mutter. Mutter l'kaimer, kasol kadatach rova dina kama, he's thinking a quarter of a dinar. L'kame parach, baishno seladalo motzela l'shai el ad chatzi v'dina ad rova. Then the Gemara, Rashi is repeating the Gemara's kasha. If we're thinking that we're talking about a quarter of a dinar, why is a quarter of a dinar? Why not, use by seller, we're saying a half, by dinner, we're saying a quarter. So now the Gemara, Abaye explained that they didn't mean that. If it's less than a quarter, he should not be able to use it. Also, lafuke mirova. So in other words, so Rashi is basically repeating the question that the Gemara asks, and then we have Abaye's answer that it didn't mean a quarter of a dinar; it meant a quarter, basically, of a selah, which is one half of a shekel, which is okay. And then the Gemara went on and said, Pachas Mekan Iser also, which is recording from the Mishnah, the Kamim Mefarish. And we're going to explain later on what that means. Lo Yim Karena, Zusha Amru also, Lakaima, Lo Hertira Yim Karena Bidamea, Lo Lataga. In other words, you shouldn't sell these coins even at a reduced price to people who will then bring it back to the market and cheat people by using it as a higher valued coin than it is. Adam honest, Adam honest is like an extortioner. Ara grotseach a murderer who has no compunction to basically put it back into circulation, and you're not going to start up with him because you know that he's a mean guy and he could do you really harm. Okay. Okay, next Rashi, is that already later? Okay.
We're what phenomenon are you on in the
We're on Nun
Gemara?
Beis Amid Aleph, Nun Beis Amid Aleph, around the middle of the page. Okay, so that's the end of Rashi. So now we're going back to the Gemara. And so Rava gave an answer to prove that Abaye was right, that Rova shekel, he meant a quarter of a shekel, not a quarter of a dinar. So a quarter of a shekel is the same as a quarter of a sela is the same as a half a shekel, but he uses it in terms of sela. Now the Gemara says, goes on weiter, Lomele lemisle ledinar b'shekel. So basically repeating the question, why does the Brisa say that by a fraction or a portion of a dinar, that we use it in terms of shekel? So the Gemara says, Milsa agav urcha kamash malon, that the Gemara is just teaching us a sort of a side matter. Agavorcha meaning sort of incidental. It's a side matter. De'ika dina de'asa mishekel. So in other words, that there is apparently there were two types of dinar. There was a dinar that was pegged or tied to the sela, and then there was a dinar that was strictly tied to a shekel. Now remember that in the proportions you have to have up to a half is okay. So if you have a half of a shekel, that's okay, but a half a shekel in a different coin can also be a quarter of a sela. They are one and the same, but they're different coins. But in terms of valuation, they are the same, and therefore, halachically, it's acceptable but there's two different types of coins is actually the point. That's why the Gemara says Milsa Agav Orcha. It's telling us an incidental matter that there are dinarim, the awesome shekel that don't translate into the realm of a sela, but only into the realm of a shekel, and it's up to a half a shekel. So again, the Mefarshim are kind of puzzled. What's the difference? What's the difference if you? Okay, the Gemara is telling us that, but there are other Amoraim who don't understand what's the issue here that we're saying, whether it's part of a shekel or part of a sela. It all amounts to the same thing. So that's the kind of the question, and so then the Gemara says that there is a value to this. Why? Messiah le Rav Ami, because by counting it in these terms, it's approved to Rav Ami. So maybe that's why the Gemara says it, is because we want to bring Rav Ami into this discussion, and we want to show that the Gemara is supporting it. Why? The Amar Rav Ami that Rav Ami says dinner habor mishekel muta lekaimo. So now there's a subtle difference here. A dinar that comes from a shekel, you are allowed to keep it and use it. Dinar habor misela, but a dinar that comes from a sela, also lekaimo, that you're not allowed to hold on to it anymore. So now we understand where the Gemara is going. Because there are two different types of dinarim, well, we thought it's one and the same. A quarter of one, a half of the other, it amounts to the same thing. Rav Ami gave a different and a subtle interpretation. And he did it as a practical matter because he said, this is how people operate. Okay? In other words, if you peg it to a sela is a bigger coin, larger, flatter, thicker. It starts eroding. People again, we're talking about because it's softer. People see that it starts eroding, and okay, in the beginning, they won't lose confidence. At some point, they're going to say, this no longer looks like a coin that I really want to have in circulation. And if someone gives it to them, they'll give it back to them and say, do me a favor, give me a different coin. And the Gemara shows us later that there are people like that. There are people like that who will be makbid. They'll be very particular about how the coin looks. Again, we don't relate to that, but that's apparently how it was at that time. That there were people who would. And did you ever see? You go to a bank or you go to a store, and they give you change, and they won't give you a bad dollar. I mean, I go to the bank and I said, "It's okay, give me whatever you have." He says, "No, they take a dollar. It doesn't look so good. They put it on the side. Obviously, they're going to return that to the mint or whatever." But you see that psychologically, people who handle money realize that that people don't want to have schmata money, as we say. You have a nice crisp bill, okay, it's $1, it's a $5, but if it's a crunched up, maybe partially Scotch tape because someone tore it, those they want to remove. That's the psychology of what this Gemara is telling us. Says Rav Ami that when a person uses a coin that starts eroding and eroding and eroding, then if you start from the highest level, which is a sela, then you can say that if it erodes enough, even though it does have value, that's what he says, Dina habon misela also lakaimo. You're forbidden from using it because now the full faith and credit of that selah will be questioned because it looks so thin and so sort of puny. But if you're talking about a dinner that comes from a shekel, even if it gets worn down, it still has a healthy look to it because it starts with a smaller coin, a shekel, and now a dinner, okay, it doesn't look so bad. But a dinner from a selah, even though it would theoretically be okay, but now people are going to think, oh, he's going to cheat me, and he's going to use it as a selah when it's really only a dinner. So Rav Ami's answer is a psychological one, and the Gemara is telling us that's why we're makbid as between when we say a quarter of a dinner, or we mean a fourth. It's only because of the hakpada that since coins do flatten out and do lose part of that silver content, we have to be makbid, and we have to think about how the public is going to use it. It's a very interesting thing that this Gemara is telling us how sensitive you have to be. And remember, this is not even an onor question, because you reach onor far quicker than you do the eroding of the coin for it to be, let's say, not even usable because it's too small from its original. So keep in mind the two separate things here. Onor is one thing. Once you reach the level of onor, you can still use the coin, but the person who was sort of cheated can I want the differential. But that doesn't say that the coin is no longer usable. It's when the coin gets even smaller and smaller and is not usable, that's when this Gemara kicks in and says, you know what? Now, not only is there no problem, now you have a bigger problem because the coin itself is now going to be not valued for what it is, and people will be cheating each other. It's one thing to cheat in ono. Okay, you cheat in ono, it's not good, but you make up that 1/6. Okay, so all right, fine. Everybody understands, and maybe not everybody's makman on the 1/6. They'll say, fine, I'm avata, you can keep it, I don't need it. But once you start dealing with, so to speak, cheating on a much higher level, because now you have coins that could be worth only 30%, 25% of the original coin. That's when Rav Ami says, no way, I'm not going to allow that. If it's a dinner that was from the shekel family, okay, now we can understand when it gets to about halfway. But when you have a dinner that derives from a selah, and now that dinner could be worth only 30% of the selah, and you're still using it as a selah, that's the chiddush. You want to use it as a selah because it's a selah coin, but in reality it has enough metal only for a dinner. So now it lost 75% of its value, and you still want to use it as a selah. No way, says Rav Ami, that I'm not going to allow. So that is where this Gemara comes in and says, okay, you know why we repeat it? It's not just a throwaway, it's to give a messiah to support Rav Ami's position that you cannot use coins that have really eroded to below their 50% mark, because then that's already cheating. Okay, I know necessarily look at a no as cheating as much as, okay, I mean, you made a mistake and it's now worth a six more, but we don't put the imprimatur of someone who's a ganef or he's a cheater. But here, this is already Geneva, because this is already at a higher level of cheating than so you have different levels of cheating is what we're talking about. Is that but it's really the intent is that when you're dealing with this kind of situation, you're really trying to take advantage. It's not just incidental. All right. Interesting Gemara. So, all right. So now we're going to go back to when the Gemara uses the term Pachas Mikain Iser Osir, and we said Lekamin Mefarish. Rashi says now we're going to delve into this word. What does it mean if it becomes less than an Iser Osir? What are we talking about? So it says the Gemara, my Kalma. What's the Brisa saying when it says Pachas Mikain Iser Osir? All right, so now Omar Abaya comes Abaya and he says, you know what it means? Pachas Sela Yosef Michdei Oino Iser Osir. That if a Sela becomes less by an Iser of the amount which is considered Oino Osir, then you can't use it as at its face value. You have to use it as actual value. So now let's understand what that means. Face value of a Sela, let's say, is $1. Actual value might be 75 cents, 80 cents, 60 cents, because it's eroded up to a point where it can be used, but you can't use it for its original amount. Have you committed fraud? Well, let's see. So says Abaya, if a Sela, which is $1, right? Yosef Michdei Oino Iser is what's 1/6? Let's go on Rameir Shita. So up to 1/6 is not considered fraud. If you're at a sixth, just at a sixth, then again the question is it inclusive, not inclusive? But let's take for the moment that it's not inclusive. That you can up to a sixth you can use it, and it's not oino. An iser less than a sixth. What is an iser? We said that there according to one sheet, that there's 8 isurim in a dinner. In other words, there's 8 isurim in a dinner. It means it's a penny. Let's call it a penny for our purposes. So a penny on the dollar, if it's a penny less than 1/6, then you've committed fraud. So again, very, very makbid here. Up to a 6, you haven't considered a fraud. No. If it's an iser, tipping the scale, 1 iser less than a 6, meaning more than a 6, obviously. If 1/6 more, 1 iser more, then that is already considered fraud. So that's how Abaya is explaining the Gemara. And he's saying that iser, which is a very, very small amount, is what tips the scale from no ono to ono. Okay, 1 iser. That's how he explains the Gemara. Amalei Rava then has a kasha on him. That if you're saying that, okay, so we're talking about a coin that is already hanging by a fraction as to whether or not it is ono, and this pushes it over the limit. Afilu mashu nami. Why do you pick on an iser, which is okay? An iser is a pretty small coin. What about a half an iser? A half an iser also pushes it over the oinoa limit. So in other words, Rava is again being very precise now, and he's saying you Abaya are using the term iser to say that if it's an iser more than oinoa, now okay, but right, you were right at the limit. Now you push yourself over the limit. Says Rava, then why did you use iser as an example? How about a half an iser? In other words, the question is how low can you go? How small can you go and still push it over that fine line? Remember, this whole Gemara is dealing with very, very fine points here. Maybe not something that anybody would even bother thinking about. Michael, okay, I don't need it. I don't need the headache of going back and getting a refund, etc. But if you're being precise, then Rava is saying to Abaya, you're using an iser. An iser isn't necessarily the smallest coin that is out there, you can have a half of an Isser. I don't know, a half penny, but a half an Isser. So the Mashahu should push it over the limit. That's Rava's theoretical kasha here is we're dealing in such small amounts, then why do we use the term Isser? That's Rava's kasha. Ella Omar Rava. So Rava wants to come to, so in other words, how does he prevent that issue from becoming up? Pachsasela Isser dinner. So that again, I don't know how satisfactory this is, but so Rav is telling us if a sela was reduced, pachsa sela iser lediner, not iser lesela, but iser ledina, which is even a smaller amount, osir. Then it's osir. So he rewords it, and he's saying what we mean here is not that it was one iser less than a sela, which then opens him up to Rava's taina, but Rava is saying it's one iser to a dinner. Do you know how small that is? I mean, that's literally a mashahu. In other words, if you're talking about an iser for a dinner is already a quarter of a sela, and you're saying it's an iser to the dinner. I mean, if you were to put your fingers together and say this is an iser, then you're fractioning it down to almost where your fingers are touching each other to say what a mashu is. Again, this is all theoretical by example to show us how makbid, how careful Chazal were that if you're going to violate the term oino, which is, by the way, an isur min HaTorah, the Torah says that you shouldn't commit oino because then you're stealing. So if you're really going to be a refined person and not want to commit an Isser of Ainah, then Rava says that even an Isser Ladiner pushes it over the line, and a person can then go back and Taina, I want my sixth. Again, we don't even deal with that today, so it's hard for us maybe to understand it. But in terms of the Gemara's understanding, we see how refined this is, that even Rava is saying Abaya, who was saying, okay, Isser, it's fine, it's an Isser. No, it's not an Isser for a Sela, it has to be an Isser for a dinner. That's how much we have to be makbid. Anyway, it's an exercise in thinking about, as the Gemara always does, opening up ours to think how careful Chazal were in dealing with Mekach and Memker, that people should not be cheated, even though most people won't even realize I've not been cheated, nothing ever happened. But you see that there was cheating, okay? Shemram ben says Rashi, Umiyira Yikabla, okay, that's from before. Roiva shekel, matbea cotton, shel chatzi dinner, it's a separate coin of a half a dinar, Vuhakori begamora Sela Medina. That's called the Sela of the Medina, which is, in other words, you have several different types of coins that could be equal to each other, but one is derived from a Sela, and one is derived from a shekel. Okay, so the Gemara says, Lamalei lemilsa ledina meshekel lemer bedina at chatzi zuz. Okay, the also meshekel in pichas hashekel at chatzia v'nasa dinar. So that you split the shekel in half and made it for dinner. Mutar l'kaima lahotzi b'dinar. So again, what we were saying before is when you're dealing with a dinar from a shekel, then it's a lot easier than if you're dealing with a dinar from a sela, where once it erodes to a dinar and people may still want to use it as a sela. That's when Rav Ami came with his chiddush and said, no, that if the dinar comes from a shekel, it's okay. But if a dinar comes from a sela, it's not okay, because their people will really go out and look to take advantage and say, oh, this is a sela, even though it's eroded down to a dinar, but it comes from, that dinar came from the sela family and not from the shekel family, as it were. In other words, a separate coin. Okay, again, a little confusing, but I think we get the point. Mike Omar Holeka Lememar Pochas Mikain Deim Omet Sela al Pochas Mishekel, because if a seller was less than a shekel, or im Omet dinner al Pochas Marova, or a dinner was less than a quarter Isser, also Lakaimoi, then you can't use it. The my area Isser Afilu Mashahu. This is Rava's Kasha. Why do we talk about an Isser Afilo masha hunami do oma b'sela at shekel v'sulo, because we say by a sela up to a shekel and not more. So now if it's a fraction, not even an isser, but a fraction below a shekel, which means below the 50% margin, then you can no longer use it as a sela. That's how refined it is. Okay, so yes, and mechteoin also, l'Rav Meir, okay. So in other words, okay, so that's now our understanding of what Rava is mechadish from before. Okay, now the Gemara says, Tanan Hossam. Okay, there's a Mishnah, not here. It's a Mishnah in Kalim. Sela shenifsala, a sela that became puzzle because it eroded more than 50%. This is again an irrelevant portion of the discussion. Veiskina shia shokelbo mashkalos, and a person says, "So what can I do with this sela? I can no longer. I have to take it out of circulation, but it has a value to me. What can I do?" So he uses it for a weight. In other words, we know that there's a whole inyan in the Torah about weights and measurements. So in other words, the Torah tells us you have to be very makbid with weights. So you have to use a weight to measure other things with. In other words, you said this is where this weight is a pound, let's say. Then you can buy produce up to a pound, and on the scale it'll equal the weight of this shekel. Right? Because now so you have to weigh the shekel and say, how much does the shekel actually weigh? And now use it as a weight. That's what you can do with a puzzle sela. But the Gemara Agavorcha tells us Tameya, this coin, a coin, Stamazoi there's no Timu and Tara on a coin. I mean, that doesn't exist. On a chayfetz, a non-coin, non-monetary, on a chayfetz, you can have Tuma. Says that Mishnah in Kalim that if you took a coin, a sela, and made it into a weight, now it's a chayfetz and it can become tameh because it's no longer a coin. That's a byproduct of the discussion. That's not the main point. But the Gemara wants to show us that how a coin which has no tumantara can become a chayfetz and become potentially tameh. Okay, at kama tipcha v'yirushoy l'kaima l'sela. So the Gemara asks the following question. So now we know that up to a point the sela can be reduced and you can no longer use it as a sela, and you have to use it, let's say, as a weight or something else. So now the kasha is how, in actuality, if that sela started reducing, how much can it reduce, and you can still use it as some kind of a coin. We'll see exactly what we can do with it, but how much? So the Gemara says, the sela, if the shnei dinrim, for a sela, if it reduces to a sela, then you can up to 2 dinrim, which by the way is a shekel. So in other words, here the Gemara, that Mishnah definitively tells us what we know from here as well, that if it's up to a half of the original value of the coin, you can use it. That's what we've been saying all along. A sela up to a shekel. That Mishnah uses the term dinrim because 2 dinrim equals 1 shekel. So he says at shnei dinrim up to 2 dinarim. Pachas mikein yod, says the Mishnah. Less than that, you should destroy it. In other words, you should not even keep it as a chayfetz of any kind because it could be confused with a coin. So now, okay, so that now, here we had a Mishnah that tells us that once a sela becomes not usable as a sela, which it doesn't tell us how much, you can use it as a weight, okay? Then it goes on to say, but how much, I guess, how much can you use it and it can still be considered a weight? Okay, it's 2 dinrim. Once it gets below 2 dinrim, then you shouldn't even use it as a weight because potentially it can be confused as a coin. You have to destroy it so that it should no longer be of any value. And we'll see what destruction means, but it shouldn't be usable in any way because this way no one will confuse it. Frek the Gemara Yosa al Kain Mai. Now, what happens if it's more than 2 dinrim? Okay, so now the Gemara is going to get into a finer machlokes here, which we'll discuss right now, is that if it is if it is 2 dinrim or slightly more than 2 dinrim, there's a machlokes amaroim. Amar Rav Huna, very interesting. Pachas mikein yautz, yeser al kein yautz, yikots, yakots. In other words, according to Rav Huna, if it's slightly more than a dinar, or slightly less than so slightly more than 2 dinrim, or slightly less than 2 dinrim, in both cases you have to destroy it. Okay. Rav Ami Omar, Rav Ami says pachas mikein yotz. If it's less than 2 dinrim, you have to destroy it, like that Mishnah says. But Yasser al Kain, but more than 2 dinrim, he can keep it. What is this machlokes? Here, the Mishnah just said that for a seller up to 2 dinrim, it's okay. Once it hits slightly less than 2 dinrim, you have to destroy it. Comes Rav Huna and he interprets the words pachos mikein yotz to mean not only pachos mikein, but even yoser al kain, that even if it's slightly more than 2 dinrim, you have to cut it up. You have to destroy it. Yakutz means to cut. So you have to cut it up or destroy it. I guess cut up, how do you cut up a coin? But whatever. I mean, it means destroy it. So this is an amazing thing, because what's Rav Huna's understanding of why you do it for both? So the pshat is like this. Let's take a look at Rashi. The pshat is yes, okay. Also, lahotzi biyafe temeya mekabelas tuma. It's mekabel tuma, like we said before from that version. Me'ata shahari also kli, because now it becomes a kli. Yokutz yichatchena l'shnayim. You break it in half or cut it in half. Dosa lafuke b'shekel. Yosa al kein yikayim b'legabi sela menakra b'chista v'lo machlifa b'sela. All right, so now this is Rashi is kind of giving us an understanding. According to, let's start with Rav Ami. Why does Rav Ami say pachas mikein yakutz? Because it's less than 50%, and we know that 50% is the fine line. When a coin gets reduced below that, it should no longer be used. But what does Rav Ami say? Yoser al kein yakum, but more he can retain it. Look at the Rashi again. Yoser al kein yikayim, more than 50%, you can be mekayim, you can use it. The legabe sela, because by a sela menakra pechista, because by a sela, when it starts reducing, you will recognize menakra, you will recognize its deficiency, that it's being smaller. V'lo machlifa b'sela, and you will not use it only for a sela. In other words, Rav Ami is saying that when people see a sela has been eroded and again, it's an eye test, because no one's standing there with a measure or with a what do they call those, scales or something that you can, or there's the instruments that you can use to tell if a coin has how much it's diminished in terms of diameter and everything. None of that. But you have an eye test. So he's saying that people, when they see a sela, they will recognize that it's deficient. V'lo machlifa b'sela, and they won't use it as a sela, they'll use it as a shekel. That's the machlokes. Rav Ami says, we trust that when people will see a sela that has been diminished, they'll say, this is not a sela, it's a shekel, because it's 50%. Rav Huna does not accept that. Rav Huna says, I worry that people will not be so sharp that when they see a sela that has been diminished, they won't know that it's no longer a seller because it's 50%. And some guy will come along and say, this is a seller. Take a look. It's got the diameter of a seller. Oh, yeah, it's eroded. It's a little thinner, but it's still a seller. That's why Rav Huna says, if it's a little bit less or a little bit more, we still have to get rid of it because even though it's a little bit more, and technically you should be able to use it as a shekel, but someone's going to cheat and say it's a seller. So if someone's going to cheat and say it's a seller, says Rav Huna, I have to protect him by saying that if now how much is a little, that's we'll have to see what that means, because he's saying pachas mikain or yeser al kain. So the pachas and the yeser is the question. How much is pachas and how much is yeser? But enough said that if it's yeser, if it turns out to be more than 50%, it's still possible according to Rav Huna, because he worries that someone's going to cheat and in the eye test is going to say, oh, this is really a selah, when it's really only not more than a shekel. Again, fascinating how makbid Chazal was in coinage, that people shouldn't cheat each other, because we're so used to it that we don't even maybe entertain that is a potential Isser midaraisa, that someone is cheating someone else, but Chazal obviously saw that, and Rav Huna was so makbid that he said that if a coin is reduced to, even though it's a little bit more than 50%, I still have to throw it out, because at that fine line of 55%, 57%, people will say, oh, it's a seller, we can use it. When in fact you can't use it as a seller, you can use it as a shekel, but I won't allow it because it doesn't pass the eye test. So that's the machlokes here between Rav Huna and Rav Ami, is to whether or not it passes the eye test, that it can be used for only, people will say, oh, no, this is not a seller, it's only a shekel, or someone will not know, and then someone who's cheating will say, oh, this is really a seller, when in fact it shouldn't be anything more than 50%, which is a shekel. So that's the okay, we'll stop here, because that's really again, the Gemara keeps on for a little bit longer to give us more insight in this whole discussion of coinage. But you see how much space, if it were, the Gemara gives to this discussion, because it was an important discussion that cheating in coin was not acceptable. So we have to be very, very, and it's machlokes amaroim. How much is cheating? How much is not cheating? In any event, this is an interesting distinction that according to Rav Huna, you have to be more makbid, and according to Rav Ami, people will see what it is, and therefore they won't worry that there is any cheating going on. All right. So
Rabbi,
yeah.
Rabbi, before, let me just see if you can clarify something. First of all, with these coins, well, if you're going to equate today's terms to years ago, we could do it either way. Years ago, we're not talking about a lot of money that we're talking about. They would go out and buy some bread, some chicken, whatever.
Right.
So they're not going to walk around with gold dinars or whatever. They're going to walk around with the smallest currency they can, because after all, many people weren't wealthy. If you're dealing with people that are in business, they're going to either go with larger quantities of gold or silver. Now they do more due diligence. I'm not going to take from you a $5,000, which is phenomenally high during those days.
Right.
But let's say it was $200. I'm not going to take an old worn out coin from you. I'm going to say, listen, I want a new coin, silver, gold, whatever it is, or I'm not going to take gold or silver from you. I mean, I won't take gold. Instead of giving me the quantity in gold, give it to me in silver. And I guess it's similar to now. Right now, what happens when you put coins into a bank, the bank gives it into the Federal Reserve, and they get back dollar for dollar, whatever it is. That if it's a coin for a nickel, they get that nickel back. They get tax back of 10. So they do this to recycle it. But we're not losing anything, and they're not losing, because the nickel is not worth a nickel, and a penny isn't worth a penny.
Right.
It's all it's the cheapest metals that we can put in that last the longest.
Right.
But going back into the olden times, I guess people were hoarding their gold because that was their means of saving it. So they wouldn't carry around large denominations for the everyday. They're going to use copper or whatever the
Right.
small.
The Gemara had said that before, that people want to use smaller denominations so they can buy stuff easily. Yes.
Yeah, because you can't. Let's say you go in with a gold dealer, nobody can change it. They don't
You have to go to
that
the
much.
money changer and then you lose. Right.
I mean, that happens even today. There are a lot of places that they'll say they won't take any bills larger than a 20.
Exactly.
They're worried
So,
about counterfeiting, which is not exactly the same as this, but it's related.
Right.
so why are we dealing so much in such a minute thing right now when we're talking about an individual to an individual opposed to in a business? We're not really talking about businesses. We're talking about how Mahmoud, the Rabbanim are to individuals.
And David, you're exactly correct that this whole discussion isn't with, let's call it, business people a little bit more sophisticated, bigger dollar amounts. That's not what this discussion is about. This discussion is intentionally about the everyday person who has a very, smaller amount of money, and Chazal is protecting them against fraud. A businessman, okay, we have to protect them, but he's more supposedly he's more sophisticated. He won't be defrauded. He'll be the one to stand up and say, "I'm not taking this coin. This coin doesn't equal, a thousand dinner or whatever it happens to be." It's bedafka for the small person, the everyday person that deals in Mekach and Memker and goes to the store and needs to buy a pound worth of bread, and he's going to be, the storekeeper says, "I'm only going to give you half a pound because this isn't a legitimate coin." Those are the people that this Gemara is dealing with, that we have to protect to make sure that they aren't cheated. It's exactly your point, is that this is how this whole Gemara deals with the ordinary, everyday person who uses coinage to buy his daily bread, his food, not the one who's transacting big business with bigger coins. That's a whole different parsha, and that we're not really addressing here. But we are addressing the person who can easily be cheated because he won't pass the eye test. He'll think that it's a selah, but it's really only a shekel, and he's lost 50% of a coin, which he desperately needs to buy his food or other things that he needs. So that's exactly your point, and I think you're 100% correct. That's what Chazal was trying to be makbid and protecting for the everyday person. Otherwise, there would be a system where the people who were more knowledgeable, the storekeepers, were taking advantage of the Hamonam and were making money on them. And these folks now, they didn't have much to begin with, and now they're going to have even less because their coinage will go 50% or 40% or 30% less than what it should. That's exactly what the point is, and that's the Hakpada. Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's why there's a strictness for the
exactly, and that's why Rav Huna was makbid, and he said, you know what, even a little bit more than that 50%, I'm not going to allow that, because that is the difference between maybe someone buying a loaf of bread or not. If they're going to think it's a selah and it's really only a shekel, or vice versa, whatever it happens to be. So that's exactly the point. That's exactly what we're dealing with. And again, we see how careful Chazal were in terms of interpreting the words of the Torah, as to it's not just happenstance. You can be over a lav, and you have to be careful not to be over a lav or to cheat someone. In other words, cuts both ways. But you have to just be honest in business, and a seller is a seller. And again, that's why we have these shiurim. Yeah, up to a certain amount, it's still a seller. At a certain point, even though it's usable, it's no longer a seller. Now, unfortunately, that's how coins were, so that they, if everything was an absolute, we wouldn't have this problem. But like you say, we're dealing with coins that had a certain softness, that, and that's why there's such a difference between coinage and merchandise, is because merchandise, a talus is a talus, a book is a book. I mean, you can't, it's not going to diminish just because the book cover or whatever got a little thinner. But with coinage, there was a bigger problem because it did diminish, And that's why there's a different set of rules for coins as there is for merchandise. Again, very fascinating. So we'll stop here, Mitzvah Shem, and we'll pick up from the Nun Beis and Beis, actually. But Mesa May will start the bottom of Nun Beis and Aleph.